Look into the eyes of someone with blue irises. Really look. What you're seeing is impossible. Not impossible like rare. Impossible like it shouldn't exist at all. Because every single person on Earth with blue eyes, all 600 to 800 million of them, descends from one individual. One person. One random ancestor who lived somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago and had a genetic accident that broke their eyes. Not broke in a bad way. Broke in a way that made them well blue. Think about that for a second. Your blue-eyed friend in California, a blue-eyed farmer in Sweden, a blue-eyed child in Argentina, they're all related. They all trace back to a single human who lived during the Mesolithic period, right when humanity was figuring out agriculture, building the first permanent settlements, and transforming from scattered bands of hunter-gatherers into something resembling civilization. And somewhere in that chaos of human history, one person's DNA made a copying error that would eventually show up in the faces of nearly 1 in 10 people alive today. Now here's where it gets really weird. Blue eyes aren't actually blue. There's no blue pigment in them at all. They're essentially a broken version of brown eyes, a mutation that stops melanin from forming properly in the iris. It's like someone tried to paint a picture but ran out of paint halfway through. And yet, this genetic malfunction became one of the most recognizable, most desired, most written about features in human history. How does that even happen? See, from a pure evolutionary standpoint, blue eyes make no sense. They don't help you see better. They don't protect your eyes from the sun. In fact, they do the opposite. Light-colored eyes are more sensitive to bright light, more prone to certain types of damage. If anything, blue eyes should have been selected against, bred out of the population within a few generations. But instead, they spread fast. Within just a few thousand years, this mutation went from one person to millions scattered across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Scientists have been obsessed with this question for decades. Why did blue eyes survive? Better yet, why did they thrive? What was so special about this particular genetic accident that it didn't just hang around, but became one of the defining features of entire populations? The answer isn't what you think. This isn't a story about better vision or environmental adaptation, not really. It's a story about ancient humans, sexual selection, migration patterns that reshaped continents, and DNA evidence pulled from bones buried for thousands of years. It's about how a single mutation changed not just eye color, but the entire structure of the human face. Because that's the thing nobody tells you about the blue eye mutation. It didn't just affect color. It altered facial features in ways scientists are only beginning to understand. Today, we've got the technology to trace this mutation backward through time. We can extract DNA from prehistoric skeletons, sequence their genes, and literally see what color eyes they had when they were alive 8,000 years ago. We know where the mutation started. We know how it spread. We even know some of the people who carried it, their names lost to history, but their genes preserved in frozen ground and ancient burial sites. And what the evidence shows is absolutely wild. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to trace the journey of the blue eye mutation from its origin in a single person through its explosive spread across prehistoric Europe. We're going to look at the science of why eyes are colored at all and what happens when that system breaks. We're going to explore the world of the Mesolithic. Imagine what life was like for that first blue-eyed human living among a sea of brown eyes. And we're going to answer the biggest question of all. How did a random genetic glitch become one of humanity's most celebrated features? Because this isn't just about eye color. It's about how we became who we are. Before we can understand why blue eyes are so special, we need to understand why they shouldn't exist at all. Here's the thing. Evolution didn't design human eyes to come in multiple colors. It designed them for one color, brown. Everything else is essentially a malfunction. But to understand why, we need to talk about the molecule that controls almost everything about how you look. Melanin. This is the master pigment. The biological paint that determines your skin color, your hair color, and yes, your eye color. It's not just decorative. Melanin is one of evolution's most important inventions. It protects your DNA from ultraviolet radiation, regulates how much vitamin D your skin produces, and shields delicate tissues from sun damage. Your eyes are full of it. Specifically, they're full of it in the iris, that colored ring surrounding your pupil. The iris is basically a sophisticated biological aperture, like the one in a camera. It opens and closes to control how much light enters your eye. But unlike a camera aperture, which is just metal or plastic, Your iris is living tissue, and living tissue exposed to light needs protection. That's where melanin comes in. The back layer of your iris is always heavily pigmented, dark brown or black in everyone. This prevents light from scattering inside your eye and ruining your vision. But the front layer, the stroma, that's where the visible color comes from. And here's what's wild. In most humans, the stroma is also packed with melanin, lots and lots of brown melanin. This creates brown eyes, the color that roughly 80% of humanity possesses. Brown eyes are the evolutionary default, the factory setting, the color that humans are supposed to have. Why? Because our species evolved in Africa under intense sunlight. Our ancestors needed maximum protection from UV radiation, both in their skin and in their eyes. High melanin production wasn't just beneficial, it was essential for survival. Anyone who couldn't produce enough melanin would suffer higher rates of skin cancer, eye damage, and other serious health problems. Natural selection favored individuals who could pump out melanin efficiently and distribute it throughout their bodies. The result was humans with dark skin, dark hair, and dark brown eyes. For millions of years, this was the only color palette available. Every human who walked the earth, from the earliest hominins to the modern humans emerging from the bottleneck we discussed earlier, had brown eyes. Every single one. But then something changed. And that something involves a gene called OCA2. This gene is like the foreman in a melanin factory. It doesn't make melanin directly, but it controls the production process. It regulates how much melanin gets produced, where it gets distributed, what type gets made. The OCA2 gene sits on chromosome 15, and when it's working normally, it ensures your iris produces plenty of melanin, giving you brown eyes. When it's working at reduced capacity, you get less melanin, maybe green eyes or hazel eyes. And when it's severely disrupted, you get albinism, the complete absence of pigment that creates pink or pale blue eyes and white hair. But here's where it gets interesting. Blue eyes aren't caused by a severe disruption of OCA2. They're caused by a very specific subtle change, a single letter mutation in the DNA sequence right next to the OCA2 gene. Not in the gene itself, but in the regulatory region that controls how much the gene gets turned on. This mutation acts like a dimmer switch. It doesn't turn melanin production off, it just turns it way, way down. Specifically in the iris, your skin might still produce normal amounts of melanin, your hair might be dark, but your eyes produce so little melanin in the front layer of the iris that something remarkable happens. There's no blue pigment. Let me say that again because it's counterintuitive. Blue eyes don't contain blue pigment. There's no blue molecule in there making them blue. Instead, blue eyes are an optical illusion, just like the blue sky. Here's how it works. When light hits an eye with very little melanin in the front layer of the iris, it penetrates into the stroma, that front layer of iris tissue. The stroma is made up of collagen fibers arranged in a semi-random pattern. When light passes through this structure, something called Rayleigh scattering occurs. Short wavelength light, blue light, gets scattered more than long wavelength light. The blue light bounces around and reflects back out toward whoever's looking at you. The longer wavelengths pass through and get absorbed by the dark pigmented layer at the back of the iris. The result? Your eyes appear blue. It's the exact same physics that makes the sky blue. There's no blue pigment in the atmosphere either. It's all about how light scatters through particles of a particular size. Your blue eyes are literally using the same optical trick as Earth's atmosphere. And by the way, if you're watching this right now, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm curious how far this story about eyes is traveling around the world. Now this explains how blue eyes work physically, but it raises an obvious question. If brown eyes are the evolutionary default, and blue eyes are caused by a mutation that reduces melanin production, why don't blue-eyed people suffer massive health problems? Shouldn't they be getting more eye damage from UV radiation, more vision problems? Shouldn't natural selection have eliminated this mutation as soon as it appeared? That's exactly what should have happened. And in Africa it probably did, many times. Random mutations occur constantly. Some individual somewhere probably developed the blue eye mutation dozens or hundreds of times over the past million years. But under the intense African sun, blue eyes would provide no advantage and several disadvantages. Those individuals probably had slightly higher rates of eye damage, and their mutation died out with them. But remember what we talked about in the last section. Humans didn't stay in Africa. Some groups moved north into Europe and Asia. They encountered very different environments, less intense sunlight, longer winters, different selection pressures. And somewhere in that changing world, around 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, someone was born with the mutation. One person, one ancestor. And for reasons we're about to explore, this mutation didn't disappear. Instead, it spread like wildfire. Within just a few thousand years, a substantial percentage of the European population had blue eyes. From one individual to millions. From a random genetic glitch to one of the most recognizable human traits. But here's something that confuses a lot of people. You've probably noticed that many babies are born with blue eyes, even if their parents have brown eyes. Those eyes often change color over the first year or two of life, eventually settling into brown or green. What's happening there? It's actually the same phenomenon we've been discussing, just in developmental terms. Newborn babies haven't finished producing melanin yet. Their melanin-producing cells, called melanocytes, are still ramping up production. At birth, even babies who will eventually have brown eyes often have very little melanin in their iris stroma. This creates the temporary appearance of blue eyes through the same Rayleigh scattering effect. As the baby grows and their melanocytes mature, melanin production increases. The stroma gradually fills with pigment. Within months or years, the blue fades and the true genetically determined eye color emerges. If the baby has the blue eye mutation, the melanin production stays permanently suppressed, and the eyes remain blue throughout life. If they don't have the mutation, the melanin keeps accumulating and the eyes turn brown or green, depending on exactly how much melanin gets produced and what type. This tells us something important. Eye color isn't a simple on-off switch. It's a spectrum controlled by multiple genes, though OCA2 and its neighbor HERK2 do most of the heavy lifting. The specific combination of genetic variants you inherit from your parents determines where on the spectrum you land. Lots of melanin, brown eyes, moderate amounts green or hazel, very little blue. And the particular mutation we're talking about, the one that causes blue eyes, is so effective at suppressing melanin production that it overrides almost everything else. It's what geneticists call highly penetrant. If you have 2 copies of the blue eye mutation, one from each parent, you will have blue eyes. No exceptions. No other genetic factors can overcome it. So now we understand the baseline. Brown eyes are normal. Blue eyes are a mutation that suppresses melanin production through a very specific regulatory change. The physics of Rayleigh scattering creates the blue color from colorless tissue. But we still haven't answered the biggest question of all. Why did this mutation spread? How did one person's random genetic accident become the eye color of hundreds of millions? That's where the story gets really interesting. Because the spread of blue eyes isn't just about genetics. It's about sex, survival, and the strange preferences that drove human evolution in directions nobody expected. So we know blue eyes shouldn't exist. We know they're the result of a broken gene, a malfunction in the melanin production system that normally gives everyone brown eyes. But here's where the story gets absolutely wild. In 2008, a team of researchers at the University of Copenhagen published a study that changed everything we thought we knew about human genetic variation. What they discovered wasn't just interesting. It was statistically impossible, or at least it should have been. The team, led by Professor Hans Eiberg, had been studying the genetics of eye color for over a decade. They'd collected DNA samples from blue-eyed individuals across multiple continents: Denmark, Jordan, India, Turkey. They wanted to understand the genetic basis of blue eyes, figure out which genes were involved, how the trait was inherited, standard population genetic stuff. But when they analyzed the data, they found something that made them check their equipment, rerun their tests, and question whether they'd made some catastrophic error in their methodology. Every single blue-eyed person they tested, from every population, every geographic region, every ethnic background, carried the exact same mutation. Not a similar mutation, not mutations in the same gene, the exact identical genetic change at the exact same position in their DNA. Let me explain why this is so bizarre. Human genetic variation is messy. When a trait evolves independently in different populations, it usually involves different mutations, different genetic pathways. If 10 different groups of people independently developed lighter skin, they'd probably do it through 10 different sets of genetic changes. That's how evolution normally works. Multiple solutions to the same problem. But blue eyes weren't like that. The mutation was singular, precise, identical across all populations. It was like finding 10 people who'd independently invented the wheel. and discovering that all 10 wheels were exactly 42.7 centimeters in diameter, made from the same type of oak, with precisely 17 spokes arranged in the same pattern. The odds against this happening by chance are astronomical. We're talking numbers so large they barely have meaning. More than all the atoms in the observable universe kind of large, which left only one possible explanation. Blue eyes didn't evolve multiple times in different populations. They evolved once, in one person, and every blue-eyed human alive today is a direct descendant of that single individual. The mutation itself sits in a gene called HERC2. Now, HERC2 doesn't directly control eye color. That job belongs to a different gene called OCA2, which we talked about earlier. OCA2 is the master regulator of melanin production in the iris. It's the gene that, when working normally, gives you brown eyes. But HERC2 sits right next to OCA2 on chromosome 15, and it acts as a genetic switch. Think of OCA2 as a light bulb and HERC2 as the dimmer switch connected to it. The mutation in HERC2 doesn't break the light bulb. It just turns down the dimmer, reducing the amount of melanin the OCA2 gene produces. The specific mutation is tiny, a single letter change in the 3 billion letter instruction manual that is human DNA. One nucleotide, one chemical building block, switching from one variant to another. In the language of genetics, it's a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism. The scientific designation is RS12913832. Just one tiny change, but it's enough to turn brown eyes blue. What's remarkable is how precisely this mutation works. It doesn't completely shut down melanin production. If it did, you'd get albinism, which causes much more severe problems than just blue eyes. Instead, it reduces melanin production by just the right amount, enough to eliminate brown pigment from the iris, but not so much that it affects melanin production in skin or hair or other tissues where it's needed for protection. It's almost surgically precise, like someone went into the human genome with a scalpel and made the smallest possible modification that would change eye color without breaking anything else. So when did this happen? When did this one person, this single human with a brand new mutation, first open their eyes and reveal a color that had never existed before? The Copenhagen team used multiple dating methods to estimate the age of the mutation. They looked at the genetic diversity surrounding the mutation site. They analyzed the geographic distribution of blue-eyed populations. They built computational models of how the mutation would have spread through ancient populations. All the evidence points to the same time frame, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. Let's split the difference and say around 8,000 years ago, roughly 6,000 BC. Now, think about what the world was like then. The Ice Age had ended. Agriculture was just beginning to transform human societies in the Fertile Crescent. People were starting to settle in permanent villages, domesticate animals, plant crops. It was the Mesolithic period in Europe, the transition between the old world of hunter-gatherers and the new world of farmers. The most likely location for this mutation? Somewhere around the Black Sea region, possibly in what's now Ukraine or southern Russia or northern Turkey. The genetic evidence suggests the mutation originated somewhere in this general area, then spread outward with migrating populations. Picture this: it's 6,000 BC. A woman gives birth to a child in a small settlement near the Black Sea. The birth is normal, the baby is healthy. But when the infant opens their eyes for the first time, everyone sees something impossible. Instead of the universal brown of human eyes, these are blue. Not the pale blue of someone with albinism, which would have been recognized as a disorder, but a clear, bright blue, strange and striking. Did the parents think their child was cursed, blessed, touched by spirits? We'll never know, but we do know that child survived to adulthood. We know they had children of their own. We know that somehow, despite starting as a single copy of a random mutation in a single person, the blue eye variant spread to become one of the most common genetic traits in entire regions of the world. This is where the story gets even stranger, because the mathematical odds of this happening, of a single neutral mutation spreading to frequencies of 70–80% in some populations, are almost as impossible as the mutation itself. Neutral mutations, changes that don't provide survival advantages, usually just drift randomly through populations. Most disappear within a few generations. The vast majority never spread beyond a tiny percentage of the population. For a neutral trait to reach high frequencies across multiple populations requires either incredible luck stretched across thousands of generations, or something else. Something that made blue eyes not neutral at all. There are only a few mechanisms that can drive a rare trait to high frequency this quickly. Population bottlenecks, where most of the population dies and survivors carry unusual genes, can do it. But there's no evidence of a massive bottleneck in European populations during this period. Genetic drift in small, isolated populations can cause random traits to become common, but the blue eye mutation spread across too wide an area, through too many different populations, for drift alone to explain it, which leaves one primary mechanism: sexual selection. The mutation spread because people with blue eyes were more attractive, more desirable as mates. They had more children. Their children inherited the trait and were also more desirable. Generation after generation, the trait became more common, not because it helped people survive, but because it helped them reproduce. But why? Why would a simple change in eye color be so attractive? What was happening in human societies 8,000 years ago that made blue eyes desirable enough to spread across entire continents? That's where this story takes another turn, because it's not just about attraction. It might be about survival after all, just not in the way anyone expected. The same genetic changes that were transforming human societies, the shift from dark-skinned hunter-gatherers to lighter-skinned agricultural populations, were creating new evolutionary pressures that would make a mutation affecting pigmentation far more important than anyone could have imagined. And blue eyes were just the beginning of changes that this mutation would bring to the human face. Picture Europe 8,000 years ago, not the Europe you know, not cities and highways and farmlands stretching to the horizon. This was a world that would be unrecognizable to modern eyes. A wilderness so vast and untamed that a person could walk for weeks without seeing another human being. Dense forests blanketed everything from Spain to Scandinavia. Ancient oak and beech trees so massive that 5 people couldn't encircle their trunks. Understory so thick you'd have to hack your way through with stone tools. And everywhere, animals. Herds of aurochs, the massive wild cattle that stood 6 feet at the shoulder. Red deer moving through forest clearings in groups of 50 or more. Wild boar crashing through undergrowth, brown bears fishing in rivers, wolves howling in the darkness beyond the firelight. This was the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, the period between the end of the Ice Age and the arrival of agriculture. And somewhere in this wild world, someone was born with eyes the color of a summer sky, eyes that shouldn't exist, eyes that carried a mutation no human had possessed before. We know this person existed. Not their name, not their story. But we know they lived because every blue-eyed person alive today carries their genetic signature. But for a long time, we didn't know what they would have looked like. We didn't know their world. We couldn't put a face to the ancestor who changed human appearance forever. Then, in 2006, 2 hikers exploring a cave system in the Cantabrian Mountains of northwestern Spain stumbled across something extraordinary. Human remains, not just any remains, but a nearly complete skeleton in remarkable condition, preserved by the cool, dry cave environment for 8,000 years. The bones belonged to a man who died in his early 30s, someone who had lived right at the dawn of the Mesolithic period. They named him Labrunya I, after the cave where he was found. For years, the skeleton sat in a laboratory. Interesting, certainly. Well-preserved, definitely. But just one more prehistoric human among thousands that archaeologists had already catalogued. Then came the DNA revolution. In 2014, researchers finally managed to extract and sequence ancient DNA from Labrunya's tooth enamel. What they found changed everything we thought we knew about prehistoric Europeans. Labrunya had blue eyes, striking, brilliant blue eyes. The genetic markers were unmistakable. He carried the same mutation on the ACA2 gene that creates blue eyes in Europeans today. But here's where it gets wild. His skin was dark, not slightly tan, not Mediterranean olive, dark brown like modern people from sub-Saharan Africa. The genetic analysis was clear. Labrunya had the darkest skin pigmentation possible for a European hunter-gatherer. Think about what that means. A man with deep brown skin and piercing blue eyes walking through the forests of prehistoric Spain. This wasn't what anyone expected. The assumption had always been that Europeans got lighter skin first, as an adaptation to lower UV radiation at northern latitudes, and then developed eye color variation later. But the DNA told a different story. The blue eye mutation had appeared and spread, while European populations still had dark skin. These two traits evolved independently, on completely different timescales. Lebranya's discovery opened a floodgate. Suddenly, researchers realized they could reconstruct not just the bones but the appearance of prehistoric humans. They started testing every well-preserved skeleton they could find, and a pattern emerged. During the Mesolithic period, Europe was populated by dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherers. Not everyone had blue eyes. The mutation was still spreading, but it was already common enough to show up repeatedly in the archaeological record. So who were these people? What was their world actually like? They lived in small groups, probably 20 to 50 individuals connected by kinship and marriage ties. Not nomadic wanderers, despite what older textbooks claim. Recent archaeological evidence shows they returned to the same locations seasonally, following predictable patterns of resource availability. Summer camps near rivers where salmon ran. Autumn gathering sites where hazelnuts and acorns could be collected and stored. Winter shelters in caves and rock overhangs where they could ride out the harshest months. Their technology was sophisticated in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. Stone tools, yes, but crafted with incredible precision. Microliths, tiny sharp blades that could be combined to create composite tools. Hafted axes with carefully ground edges. Bone needles fine enough to sew waterproof clothing. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of elaborate food processing techniques. They were roasting hazelnuts in pit ovens to make them easier to store, smoking fish and meat to preserve it through winter, possibly even fermenting plant materials to create primitive alcohol, though the evidence for that is still debated. They had figured out which plants were edible, which were medicinal, and which were deadly. Knowledge that took generations to accumulate and required sophisticated language to transmit. Their social world was probably rich and complex. Burial sites from this period show evidence of ritual and ceremony. Bodies carefully positioned, sometimes with grave goods, ochre pigments, perforated shells that might have been jewelry. They were people who thought about death, who mourned their loved ones, who had beliefs about what came after. And into this world, someone was born with blue eyes. Try to imagine what that must have been like. In a community where everyone, literally everyone you'd ever seen, had brown eyes, a child is born with eyes the color of ice, the color of deep water, the color of the sky at midday. This wasn't a subtle variation. This was dramatic, unmistakable, probably slightly unsettling to people who'd never seen anything like it. The child would have been noticed immediately, not just by their family, but by everyone in the community. In a world where physical appearance was one of the few ways to distinguish individuals, where personal identity mattered enormously in small, close-knit groups, this would have been remarkable. They would have stood out in memory, stand out in stories, stand out when visitors from other groups came to trade or negotiate marriages. And here's the thing about standing out in prehistoric societies: it could go either way. Sometimes different meant special, chosen, marked by the spirits for some great purpose. The archaeological record shows that people with unusual physical traits sometimes received special treatment, elaborate burials, positions of authority, evidence they were valued by their communities. But sometimes different meant dangerous, potentially cursed, someone to be cast out or killed before they could bring misfortune to the group. The fact that the blue eye mutation survived and spread tells us something crucial. These individuals weren't killed, they weren't cast out. They were accepted, and more than that, they were probably desired, because the mutation didn't just survive, it exploded across the European population at a rate that genetics tells us can only happen through one mechanism: sexual selection. People with blue eyes were having more children, significantly more children. The math is actually startling. For a neutral mutation, one that provides no survival advantage, to reach the frequency blue eyes achieved in just a few thousand years, carriers would need to have 15 to 20% more offspring than non-carriers. That's enormous. That's the kind of selection pressure usually reserved for traits that directly impact survival, like disease resistance or better food processing ability. But blue eyes don't help you hunt. They don't make you better at gathering plants or building shelters or surviving winter. If anything, light-colored eyes are slightly disadvantageous in bright sunlight, providing less protection against UV damage than dark eyes. So why did they spread? What was happening in those Mesolithic communities that made blue-eyed individuals so reproductively successful? The answer requires us to think about attraction, about beauty standards, about how humans choose mates and why. It requires us to understand something that might seem trivial but turned out to be one of the most powerful forces in human evolution: sexual selection, the same force that gave peacocks their absurd tails and lions their magnificent manes. And it was about to transform the face of an entire continent. So here's the puzzle. Around 10,000 years ago, somewhere near the Black Sea, a single person was born with blue eyes. One individual carrying one mutation. Fast forward just 8,000 years to the present day, and that mutation has spread to nearly 40% of Europeans, with pockets of blue-eyed populations scattered from Scandinavia to Syria. That's not slow evolutionary drift. That's explosive. Something made blue eyes spread faster than almost any other physical trait in human history. The question is, why? Natural selection is what most people think of when they hear about evolution. Traits that help you survive get passed on. Traits that get you killed disappear. Simple, brutal, effective. But Darwin described another force that's just as powerful and way more interesting: sexual selection. This isn't about survival. It's about reproduction. Specifically, it's about who gets chosen as a mate and who doesn't. Here's the crucial difference. Natural selection cares if you make it to reproductive age. Sexual selection cares if anyone wants to reproduce with you once you get there. You can be the fittest, strongest, most survival-capable individual in your population, but if nobody chooses you as a mate, your genes are evolutionary dead ends. Your perfect survival adaptations die with you. This is why peacocks have those ridiculous tails. Those massive, colorful, completely impractical tails that make them easy targets for predators. Natural selection would eliminate those tails in a heartbeat. They're survival liabilities. But peahens prefer males with bigger, brighter tails. So sexual selection favors exactly the trait that natural selection should be eliminating. The peacocks with the most absurd tails get more mates, produce more offspring, and pass on genes for even more ridiculous tails. Blue eyes might be humanity's version of the peacock's tail, not a survival advantage but a mating advantage. And in small populations, mating advantages can spread frighteningly fast. The mechanism is called the rare advantage hypothesis. When everyone around you looks basically the same, anyone who looks different stands out, and standing out, in the right context, gets you noticed, gets you remembered, gets you chosen. Picture a Mesolithic community somewhere in what's now Ukraine, population maybe 50, 60 people. Everyone has brown eyes, dark hair, medium skin tone. They all look like variations on the same theme because they're all closely related, all descended from the same small founder population that settled this territory a few hundred generations back. Then someone is born with blue eyes, not just slightly lighter brown, bright, startling, impossible to ignore blue. That person doesn't blend into the background. When they look at you, you remember it. When they're choosing mates, they get attention. When they have children, people notice which children inherited the trait. Studies done in modern populations show blue eyes trigger interesting responses. In several experiments, participants rated blue-eyed faces as more trustworthy, more attractive, or more memorable than identical faces with brown eyes. The effect is small but measurable, and in evolutionary terms, small effects repeated over hundreds of generations become enormous differences. But here's what makes this really powerful. The rare advantage only works when the trait is rare. If everyone has blue eyes, nobody stands out. So the effect is strongest in the early generations after the mutation appears. That first blue-eyed person and their immediate descendants would have experienced the maximum possible advantage. Then, as blue eyes became more common, the advantage would gradually diminish. This creates a kind of evolutionary sweet spot. The mutation spreads rapidly at first because it's novel and attention-grabbing. Then the spread slows as the trait becomes less unusual. Eventually, you reach an equilibrium where blue eyes are common enough that they're not particularly remarkable anymore, but not so common that brown eyes become the rare, attractive variant. And that's pretty much what we see in European populations. Blue eyes spread explosively for a few thousand years, then stabilized at frequencies ranging from 10% to 80% depending on the region. They're not taking over completely, but they're not disappearing either. But there's another theory. One that's way more controversial and makes evolutionary biologists argue in ways that would shock their students. The paternity certainty hypothesis. Fair warning, this one gets weird. The basic idea is this. In any species where males invest heavily in offspring, males need some way to be reasonably sure the offspring they're raising are actually theirs. In most mammals, this isn't a huge issue because males don't stick around to raise young. But humans are different. Human infants are helpless for years. They require massive parental investment. Throughout most of human evolution, males who invested resources in children that weren't genetically theirs were at a massive evolutionary disadvantage. Blue eyes might have offered a solution. Brown eyes are dominant, blue eyes are recessive. If both parents have blue eyes, all their children will have blue eyes. Period. No exceptions. So in a population where blue eyes were emerging as a trait, a blue-eyed male choosing a blue-eyed female could be absolutely certain that any blue-eyed children were his. The hypothesis suggests blue-eyed individuals preferentially chose other blue-eyed mates, creating what geneticists call assortative mating. And if this preference was strong enough, it would create a kind of self-reinforcing cycle. Blue-eyed people have blue-eyed children who preferentially mate with other blue-eyed people, creating more blue-eyed descendants who continue the pattern. Now, here's why this theory makes people argue. First, it assumes a level of genetic knowledge that Mesolithic people absolutely did not have. They couldn't know that eye color was heritable in specific patterns. They couldn't understand dominant and recessive alleles. So any preference for same eye color mates would have to be instinctive or cultural, not rational. Second, there's not much evidence for strong assortative mating based on eye color in modern populations. People with blue eyes don't overwhelmingly prefer blue-eyed partners. If they did, we'd expect to see much more extreme frequency differences than we actually observe. Third, and most damning, the math doesn't really work. Even with strong assortative mating preferences, the spread of blue eyes happened too fast to be explained by paternity certainty alone. You'd need additional evolutionary forces pushing the trait forward. So if it wasn't just sexual selection and probably wasn't paternity certainty, what else could explain the explosive spread? 2 words: genetic drift. In small populations, random chance plays an enormous role in which genes get passed on and which disappear. Imagine a village of 40 people where one individual carries the blue eye mutation. That person might have more children than average just by luck. Maybe they're healthy and live to an old age while others die young. Maybe their children happen to survive a disease outbreak that kills other families' children. None of this has anything to do with eye color, but the blue eye gene spreads anyway because it happened to be in lucky individuals. This is especially powerful when populations are expanding into new territories. The Mesolithic period in Europe was a time of rapid population growth after the ice sheets retreated. Small groups were constantly splitting off and settling new regions. If the founders of one of these new settlements happened to include a high proportion of blue-eyed individuals, just by chance, the new population would have a much higher frequency of blue eyes than the parent population. Geneticists call this the founder effect, and it can create dramatic differences between closely related populations in just a few generations. Some regions of Europe might have received founder populations with multiple blue-eyed individuals. Others might have been settled by groups with no blue-eyed members at all. This would explain why blue eye frequencies vary so dramatically across Europe, from over 80% in Finland and Estonia to less than 10% in southern Europe. So what really happened? Probably all of it working together. Sexual selection giving blue eyes an initial advantage when they were rare and novel. Genetic drift amplifying these small advantages in expanding populations. Founder effects creating regional pockets where blue eyes became especially common. And maybe, just maybe, some degree of assortative mating reinforcing the patterns once they were established. Evolution isn't usually driven by one simple mechanism. It's messy, complicated, involving multiple forces working in different directions simultaneously. The winning traits are the ones that happen to be favored by enough of these forces at the right times. Blue eyes won. Not because they helped anyone survive, not because they made anyone smarter or stronger, but because in the specific context of Mesolithic Europe, with its expanding populations, its social structures, and its mating preferences, blue eyes were interesting enough to be remembered, distinctive enough to be attractive, and lucky enough to be in the right populations at the right times. Within 4,000 years, what started as one mutation in one person had spread across half a continent, not through any grand adaptive advantage, but through the accumulated power of millions of individual mate choices, thousands of lucky population expansions, and the inexorable mathematics of gene flow in expanding populations. But here's what's wild. While sexual selection was driving blue eyes across Europe, something else was happening. something that might have given blue eyes a real survival advantage after all. But sexual selection doesn't explain everything, because there's another possibility, one that's less romantic but possibly more important for survival. What if blue eyes weren't just attractive? What if they actually helped you live longer? Welcome to the vitamin D hypothesis, and it's complicated. Here's what we know for certain. Vitamin D is absolutely critical for human survival. Not just helpful, critical. Without adequate vitamin D, your bones don't develop properly. Children get rickets, their legs bow under their own weight. Adults develop osteomalacia, their bones becoming soft and prone to fractures. Pregnant women without enough vitamin D have higher rates of complications. Their babies are more likely to die. For most of human history, this wasn't a problem. Our ancestors evolved in Africa, under intense sunlight. UV radiation hits the skin and triggers vitamin D synthesis. Plenty of sun, plenty of vitamin D. The evolutionary solution was simple: dark skin that provided protection from UV damage, while still allowing enough vitamin D production. But then humans started moving north. Picture the descendants of that blue-eyed individual, spreading across Europe during the Mesolithic period. They're moving into territories that are radically different from anywhere humans had lived before. Not just colder, but darker. Northern Europe during winter gets maybe 8 hours of daylight, sometimes less. And the sun, even when it's visible, stays low on the horizon, weak, indirect. The UV radiation that triggers vitamin D synthesis drops to a fraction of what it was in Africa or the Mediterranean. Now here's where it gets interesting. Dark skin, which had been a survival advantage in sunny climates, suddenly becomes a liability. Melanin, the pigment that makes skin dark, blocks UV radiation. That's its job. In Africa, this protection is crucial. Too much UV causes skin cancer, destroys folate, leads to birth defects. But in Northern Europe, UV radiation isn't the problem anymore. The problem is getting enough of it. So natural selection starts favoring lighter skin. Not immediately, not all at once, but over thousands of years. Individuals with genetic variants that produce less melanin had an advantage. They could synthesize more vitamin D from the limited sunlight available. They had healthier children. Those children survived to reproduce. The genes spread. This part isn't controversial. Scientists have strong evidence that light skin evolved independently in multiple human populations that moved into low sunlight environments. Europeans got lighter. East Asians got lighter through different genetic pathways. Same environmental pressure, different genetic solutions. But what about blue eyes? Here's the hypothesis. Maybe eye color and skin color evolved together as part of the same adaptive package. The genes that control skin pigmentation and eye pigmentation aren't identical, but they're related. They're part of the same broader genetic system that determines how much melanin your body produces and where. So maybe the mutation that created blue eyes didn't spread just because people thought it was attractive. Maybe it spread because it was linked to lighter skin, and lighter skin was keeping people alive. Some researchers go even further. They point out that blue eyes, light skin, and blonde hair all tend to cluster together in the same populations. The highest frequencies of all three traits are found in Scandinavia and the Baltic region, the same areas that have the lowest UV radiation levels in the inhabited world. This can't be coincidence, they argue. This is natural selection writing its signature across the human genome. The timeline seems to support this. The blue-eyed mutation appears around 10,000 years ago. The major expansion of farming populations into northern Europe happens between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago. As these populations move north, they encounter increasingly severe vitamin D challenges, and the frequency of blue eyes, light skin, and blonde hair all increase together. It's a compelling story. Population moves north, environment applies selection pressure, advantageous traits spread. Classic Darwinian evolution. But here's where the skeptics start raising objections. First problem: blue eyes don't actually help with vitamin D synthesis. The pigmentation we're talking about is in the iris, the colored part of the eye. It doesn't affect how much UV radiation reaches the skin. Having blue eyes versus brown eyes makes zero difference in your body's ability to produce vitamin D. The iris pigmentation and skin pigmentation are controlled by related but distinct genetic pathways. Just because they're associated doesn't mean one caused the other. Second problem: the timing is weird. The mutation that created blue eyes appears around 10,000 years ago, but genetic analysis suggests light skin in Europeans was already common by this point. Some variants for light skin date back 30,000 years or more, so if light skin was the real survival advantage, why did blue eyes show up so late and spread so fast? If it was just hitchhiking along with skin color genes, you'd expect a much slower, more gradual spread. Third problem, the geography doesn't quite work. Yes, blue eyes are most common in Scandinavia and the Baltic, but they're also found at significant frequencies in places with much more sunlight. Parts of Germany, Britain, even southern France have blue-eyed populations. Meanwhile, some populations that live in extremely low-light environments, like the Sami people of northern Scandinavia, have relatively low frequencies of blue eyes. If this was purely about vitamin D, you'd expect a much tighter correlation between latitude and eye color. Fourth problem, and this is the big one, other human populations solved the northern sunlight problem without blue eyes. East Asians moved into high latitudes too. They developed light skin through different genetic mutations. But they didn't develop blue eyes, they didn't develop blonde hair. They maintained dark eyes and dark hair while still adapting perfectly well to low UV environments. This suggests that blue eyes weren't actually necessary for survival in the north. So what's really going on? Most likely it's complicated. The truth is probably somewhere between pure sexual selection and pure survival advantage. Blue eyes may have started spreading because people found them attractive, but once they reached a certain frequency in northern European populations, they may have been maintained by a weak association with light skin genes, not strong enough to drive their initial spread, but enough to prevent them from disappearing. Think of it like this. The blue eye mutation appears in a population that's already under selection pressure for light skin. The mutation doesn't help with vitamin D directly, but it doesn't hurt either. And it makes you stand out in a world where everyone has brown eyes. So sexual selection starts driving it upward in frequency. As it spreads, it becomes more common in individuals who also carry light skin genes. Not because they're directly linked, but just because they're in the same population experiencing the same selection pressures. Over time, blue eyes become associated with successful adaptation to northern environments. Not because they caused that success, but because they were present during it. They become part of the phenotype package, the collection of traits that characterize northern European populations. But here's what makes the vitamin D hypothesis so persistent despite the objections. Scandinavia, because when you look at the global distribution of blue eyes, one pattern is absolutely undeniable. The highest frequencies, the places where blue eyes are most common, are precisely the places with the most severe vitamin D challenges. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, these aren't just northern. They're northern and cloudy, dark forests and long winters, months where the sun barely rises above the horizon. In some regions of Finland, over 80% of the population has blue eyes. In Estonia, it's over 90%. These are the highest frequencies of any physical trait in any human population anywhere. Something made blue eyes extraordinarily successful in these specific environments. Maybe it was sexual selection operating with unusual intensity in small, isolated populations. Maybe it was genetic drift, random chance amplified by population bottlenecks. Maybe it was a weak survival advantage that only mattered in the most extreme low-light environments. Or maybe, most likely, it was all of these factors working together, because evolution doesn't operate through single causes. It's not one factor pushing a trait in one direction. It's multiple selection pressures, random genetic drift, population structure, cultural preferences, all interacting in complex ways across thousands of generations. Blue eyes spread through northern Europe through some combination of all these forces. We're still trying to figure out exactly what that combination was, but one thing is certain. By 5,000 years ago, blue eyes had become firmly established in northern European populations. The mutation that started in one person had spread to millions, and it was about to change human history in ways nobody could have predicted, because those blue-eyed northern Europeans were about to start migrating again, and when they did, they would carry their distinctive eye color to the farthest corners of the earth, creating patterns of genetic diversity that we're still mapping today. For most of human history, we could only guess what our ancestors looked like. We had their bones, their tools, their art, but the actual color of their eyes, their skin, their hair, that was lost to time, until it wasn't. In 2010, everything changed. A team of scientists at the Copenhagen Center for Genomic Research published a paper that seemed almost like science fiction. They had extracted DNA from human bones thousands of years old and reconstructed not just who these people were related to, but what they actually looked like: eye color, hair color, skin tone, all of it coded in genetic sequences that had somehow survived millennia buried in the ground. This was revolutionary, because DNA isn't supposed to last that long. It's a fragile molecule, constantly breaking down, degrading into smaller and smaller fragments until there's nothing left to analyze. In tropical climates, DNA can disappear completely within a few hundred years. Even in ideal conditions, cold and dry environments, most DNA becomes unreadable after about 10,000 years, but most isn't all. And scientists had figured out how to work with what remained. The technique goes like this. You take a sample from inside a tooth or from the densest part of a long bone, places where DNA degradation happens slowest. You extract every fragment of genetic material you can find, most of it contaminated with bacterial DNA, fungal DNA, DNA from every organism that's been in contact with the bone for thousands of years. Then you use computational methods to filter out the contamination, identify the fragments that are genuinely human, and piece them together like the world's most complicated jigsaw puzzle where 90% of the pieces are missing and another 5% are from completely different puzzles. It's painstaking work. A single analysis can take months or years, but when it works, when you finally reconstruct enough of the genome to identify specific genes, you can answer questions that historians have been asking for centuries. And in 2018, one of those questions got an answer that shocked everyone. The discovery came from a cave in southwest England called Goes Cave. Inside, archaeologists had found a nearly complete skeleton of a man who died around 10,000 years ago, during the Mesolithic period. He became known as Cheddar Man, named after the nearby village. For decades, museum reconstructions showed him with light skin and brown hair, because everyone assumed that's what ancient Britons looked like. Everyone was wrong. When scientists finally sequenced Cheddar Man's genome, they found something unexpected. The genes for blue eyes were there, both copies, unambiguous, but the genes for light skin, absent. Cheddar Man had dark skin, dark curly hair, and brilliant blue eyes, a combination that essentially doesn't exist in modern populations. He looked nothing like the people living in Britain today, despite being their direct ancestor. This was revolutionary not just because of what Cheddar Man looked like, but because of what his appearance revealed about European genetic history. Light skin hadn't evolved in Europe. It had been imported, arriving thousands of years after blue eyes. But Cheddar Man wasn't alone. As ancient DNA technology improved, more surprises emerged from prehistoric bones across Europe. In Luxembourg, scientists analyzed the remains of a man from the Lochba rock shelter, another Mesolithic hunter-gatherer who died around 8,000 years ago. Same combination. Blue eyes, dark skin, dark hair. In Spain, at La Brunera Cave, two more hunter-gatherers from 7,000 years ago. Blue eyes, dark skin. In Sweden, on the island of Gotland, remains from 5,000 years ago. Blue eyes, dark skin. The pattern was unmistakable. For thousands of years after blue eyes first appeared, the people carrying that mutation looked radically different from modern Europeans. They were the descendants of populations that had evolved in Africa, still carrying the high melanin production that protected against intense UV radiation, but they also carried that single mutation in the OCA2 gene that gave them blue eyes. Think about how strange this is. Blue eyes evolved in a population that didn't yet have light skin. The mutation spread, became common, remained in the population for thousands of years before the light skin genes arrived. This tells us something crucial about how evolution actually works. It's not coordinated. It's not designed. Traits don't evolve together just because they seem like they should go together. Blue eyes spread because they provided some advantage, or because people preferred them sexually. Light skin evolved separately, in response to different selection pressures. And eventually, both traits ended up in the same populations, not because evolution planned it that way, but because human populations mixed, merged, and exchanged genes for thousands of years. But where did the light skin genes come from? Ancient DNA gave us that answer too. Around 8,000 years ago, a massive migration began that would fundamentally transform European genetics. Farming communities from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, started moving into Europe, bringing with them agriculture, pottery, domesticated animals, and a completely different genetic profile. These Neolithic farmers looked nothing like the hunter-gatherers they encountered. They had lighter skin, brown eyes, and dark hair. They'd evolved their light skin in the Middle East, where reduced sunlight during agricultural life and settled communities had favored lighter pigmentation for vitamin D production. The archaeological record shows what happened next. Within about 2,000 years, farming had spread across almost all of Europe. The genetic record shows something more complex. The farmers didn't just replace the hunter-gatherers, they mixed with them, interbred, formed hybrid communities, exchanged genes and cultures. The blue eyes from the hunter-gatherers met the light skin from the farmers, and for the first time, you got populations that looked something like modern Europeans. But the story wasn't over. Around 5,000 years ago, a third wave arrived. From the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea came horse-riding, bronze-working pastoralists called the Yamnaya. They were tall, powerfully built, and carried genes for light skin, light hair, and sometimes blue eyes. They also brought lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk in adulthood, a trait that would become dominant across northern Europe. The Yamnaya migration was catastrophic for existing populations. Genetic analysis shows that in some regions, up to 90% of the male lineages were replaced within just a few generations. This suggests not peaceful integration but violent conquest. The Yamnaya and their descendants essentially took over, bringing with them new languages that would eventually evolve into most modern European languages, new social structures, and new genetic profiles. Modern Europeans are the product of all three groups. Roughly speaking, about 10% of your DNA comes from those original hunter-gatherers with blue eyes and dark skin. About 40% comes from the Neolithic farmers, and about 50% comes from the Yamnaya and related steppe populations. The exact proportions vary depending on where in Europe your ancestors lived, but the three-way mixture is consistent across the continent. This means that if you have blue eyes today, there's a very good chance you inherited them from those original hunter-gatherers. The mutation has been passed down through dozens of migrations, conquests, and population replacements over 10,000 years. Your eyes are a direct link to people who looked radically different from you but shared that one specific genetic trait. And we only know this because of ancient DNA, because scientists figured out how to extract genetic information from bones that had been buried for millennia. Every year, new techniques emerged that let us analyze older specimens, extract more information, answer questions we couldn't even ask a decade ago. Recently, researchers managed to extract DNA from a 400,000-year-old human ancestor in Spain. 400,000 years. That's older than our species, and yet fragments of DNA survived, enough to tell us about relationships between different human lineages during the period when Neanderthals were just beginning to split from our ancestors. The ancient DNA revolution is still accelerating. With every new genome sequenced, we learn more about where we came from, how we evolved, and why we look the way we do. We're rewriting human history not from written records or archaeological interpretation, but from the genetic blueprints carried in prehistoric bones. And those blueprints are telling us stories more complex and surprising than anyone imagined. Stories like the one about blue eyes appearing thousands of years before light skin. About traits we think belong together actually arriving in populations from completely different sources at completely different times. About our ancestors looking nothing like we assumed they did. But ancient DNA has revealed something else too. Something that connects directly to why blue eyes spread so quickly once they appeared. Human populations have never been isolated, never stayed pure. Throughout our entire history we've been mixing, migrating, trading genes across vast distances. And in that constant genetic exchange, certain traits spread faster than others. Blue eyes didn't stay put. Once that original mutation took off in ancient Europe, it didn't just sit politely north of the Mediterranean and wait for modern borders to be drawn. It moved with people. It hitched rides on trade routes, on migrations, on kidnapped captives and wandering herders and shipwrecked sailors. And today, if you look closely enough, you find its fingerprints in places that absolutely should not have them, unless you know the real story. Let's zoom out first. If you could dim the lights on the planet and make only blue eyes glow, the brightest patch would still be northern and eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the Baltic states, parts of northern Germany, Poland, Russia. In some of these regions, more than half the population has light eyes. In a few, it's closer to 3 out of 4. If you grow up there, blue eyes aren't special, they're background noise. Move south and west and the glow fades. Across most of southern Europe, blue and green eyes are common, but brown dominates. Cross into the Mediterranean's southern shore, the Middle East, South Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa, and brown eyes take over almost completely. Not because blue eyes belong to Europeans in some deep, essential way, but because of where that mutation first became common, and how many times it did or didn't get diluted by other genes. That's the basic map. But when you zoom in, the story gets weird. Because in some places, in the middle of overwhelmingly brown-eyed populations, you suddenly run into pockets of light eyes that look like they were dropped in by a careless time traveler. Take Afghanistan. If you walk through Kabul or a remote village in Nuristan, you can absolutely meet people with light eyes. Hazel, gray, green, even piercing blue. Dark hair, brown skin, Central Asian features, and eyes that wouldn't look out of place in Sweden. For a long time, travelers treated these people like living conspiracy theories. Lost Roman legion, descendants of Alexander the Great's soldiers, secret Europeans. The reality is both less romantic and more interesting. Afghanistan sits at a crossroads. Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East. For thousands of years, armies have crashed through here. Indo-Iranian steppe riders, Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Turks, Mongols. Every invasion, every migration brought new genes, including the European origin HERK2 mutation for blue eyes. Then the mountains did something important. They trapped people. Isolated valleys, endogamous communities, small populations marrying mostly among themselves. That's the perfect recipe for rare traits to stick around and sometimes become more visible. You don't need a lost legion, you just need one or a few carriers of the mutation, and a few hundred years of genetic isolation. The result? A village where 3 siblings have sky-blue eyes, and their grandparents and cousins do too, even though nobody there thinks of themselves as anything but Afghan. The same pattern shows up across parts of the Middle East. Most people in places like Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, northern Iraq, and Iran have brown eyes. But light eyes are way more common there than you'd expect if blue eyes were supposed to be only in northern Europe. You can find families with green, gray, and blue eyes scattered through old city quarters and mountain towns, often with no recent European ancestors at all. Why? Because for thousands of years this region was the superhighway of the ancient world, the Fertile Crescent, the Levant, Anatolia. These are the corridors through which early farmers, Indo-European speakers, and later steppe migrants moved. Ancient DNA from skeletons in the Near East shows clear traces of gene flow from populations related to early Europeans and to later steppe herders. The blue eye mutation rode along. Once it's in a population, it doesn't disappear just because most people around you have brown eyes. It hides as recessive combinations, surfaces in the next generation when 2 carriers happen to have children together, fades out again, then pops up in a distant cousin. To the family, it feels like random chance. To a geneticist, it's the echo of migrations 5,000 or 6,000 years old. Then there's North Africa. If you stand in a market in Marrakesh, Tunis, or Algiers and just watch faces, you'll see something that doesn't fit the simple Africa equals dark eyes, Europe equals light eyes story. You'll see people who'd easily pass in southern Spain or Sicily, olive skin, dark or auburn hair, and gray-blue or green eyes. A big part of that story belongs to the Berbers, or Amazigh peoples, the indigenous populations of North Africa whose roots stretch back long before the Arab conquests, before Rome, even before the pyramids. Genetic studies on Berber-speaking communities in Morocco, Algeria, and parts of the Sahara show surprisingly high frequencies of European-linked variants, including the blue eye mutation. How did they get there? 2 main ways. First, geography. North Africa and southern Europe are separated by a narrow sea, not an impassable wall. For tens of thousands of years, people crossed the Mediterranean in both directions. Traders, fishermen, migrants, invaders. Early European farmers, Phoenician traders, Roman settlers, Vandals, Visigoths, later Spanish and Portuguese colonists. All brought in small but steady trickles of European genes. Second, isolation again. Many Berber groups historically lived in relatively closed communities, mountain villages in the Atlas Range, oases deep in the Sahara, Limited marriage outside the group means whatever genetic variants happen to be present can drift to higher frequencies, including light eye colors. That's why some Berber communities have rates of blue or green eyes that rival parts of southern Europe, even though they're firmly rooted in Africa. But you don't have to go to famous crossroads to find strange eye color pockets. Some of the clearest clues about human movement come from tiny, isolated populations that kept themselves to themselves for centuries. Island groups, remote mountain villages, religious minorities that marry mostly within their own community. These are natural genetic laboratories. In some isolated Baltic islands, for example, blue eyes are so dominant that brown eyes are rare curiosities. In a few small communities in the Caucasus, you find striking frequencies of light eyes surrounded by regions where dark eyes are overwhelmingly common. Among certain groups like the Kalash in northern Pakistan, a small non-Muslim minority surrounded by Muslim neighbors. Light eyes and hair show up more often than you'd expect for the region. When geneticists map these populations, they don't just see quirky eye colors. They see records of ancient migrations, steppe herders pushing into South Asia, farmers expanding from Anatolia, maritime traders leaving genetic calling cards on islands hundreds of miles from their homeland. Blue eyes are like tracer dye in the bloodstream of human history. Wherever they show up in an unexpected place, you know some mixture, some migration, some long-ago contact happened. But while blue eyes have spread far from their cradle, something else is happening at the same time. Their overall share of the human gene pool is shrinking. In the early 1900s, surveys suggested that in countries like the United States, more than half of white Americans had blue eyes. Today, that number is closer to 1 in 4, and dropping. Similar declines are happening in places like Britain, Germany, and Australia, not because blue eyes are being selected against in some brutal Darwinian sense, but because the world we live in now is fundamentally different from the one that created that initial blue-eye boom. For most of history, people tended to marry close to home. Villages, clans, religious groups, ethnic communities. In Northern and Eastern Europe, that meant blue-eye genes were mostly bouncing around among other blue-eye carriers. Recessive traits love that kind of setup. Put 2 carriers together often enough, and you get a lot of blue-eyed kids. Now zoom out to the 21st century. Modern migration is scrambling the deck. People from historically blue-eyed regions are having children with people from historically brown-eyed regions at rates that would have been unthinkable even a century ago. A blue-eyed Dane marries a brown-eyed Nigerian in London. A Polish-Filipino couple raises kids in Chicago. A Syrian sweet family moves to Melbourne. In these pairings, brown eye alleles often dominate in the first generation because brown is genetically dominant over blue. A blue-eyed parent and a brown-eyed parent will usually have brown-eyed children, though those children might still carry the blue-eye variant hidden in their DNA. So the visible percentage of blue eyes goes down, even if the underlying mutation is still spreading quietly through more and more genomes. Give it a few generations, and the picture gets even more complex. 2 brown-eyed people, both carrying 1 copy of the blue-eye mutation, can have a blue-eyed child. That surprises families, but it doesn't surprise genetics. The trait is still there. It's just not clustering in obvious ways anymore. That's the paradox of our age. On one hand, the classic blue-eyed countries are becoming more diverse. Pure, ice blue eyes are statistically less common than they were a century ago. On the other hand, the blue-eye mutation itself is more globally distributed than at any time in human history. It's no longer a regional quirk. It's woven into the genomes of people who will never be coded as European in any social sense. So if you try to imagine the future, you don't get a world where blue eyes simply vanish. You get a world where they pop up in increasingly unexpected places. A kid in Sao Paulo with Japanese and Angolan grandparents. A family in Cairo whose great-great-grandfather came from Sicily. A teenager in Delhi with 1 Kashmiri and 1 Danish parent. Blue eyes might not dominate entire countries anymore. Instead, they'll show up as genetic surprises scattered across a genuinely global population. And that brings us back to the mutation itself. 1 tiny change in 1 person, somewhere around the shores of the Baltic or the Black Sea, thousands of years ago. It spread through hunters and gatherers, farmers and herders, traders and conquerors. It survived wars, plagues, famines, and the rise and fall of empires. It crossed deserts and mountain ranges and oceans. It slipped into new gene pools and hid there for centuries, only to reveal itself suddenly in a newborn stare. But that mutation didn't just change the color of our eyes. It did something stranger. It quietly reshaped the human face itself. So far we've been talking about blue eyes as if they were just eyes, a splash of color in the iris, a cosmetic detail. But that little mutation didn't just repaint the window. It quietly remodeled the whole frame. Because here's the thing genetics never does. It almost never changes just one thing. When that ancient mutation hit the OCA2/HERC2 region, the switch that dials down melanin in the iris, it didn't land in some isolated eye color folder. It hit a control center, a regulatory zone wired into a much larger system that helps decide how pigment forms, how tissue develops, how our faces assemble themselves, cell by cell in the womb. And when you stop messing with the regulators, you don't just get new colors, you get new faces. Modern genetic studies are brutally clear on this. When researchers scan hundreds of thousands of people and look for the DNA variants linked to blue eyes, those same regions keep popping up again and again in other traits. Lighter hair, lighter skin, slightly different nose shapes, differences in eyebrow thickness, even subtle changes in how the bones around the eye socket grow. It's not that one blue eye gene is doing all of this, like some puppet master. It's that this little neighborhood of DNA sits in the middle of a developmental conversation. How much melanin should we make? How thick should the tissues be here? How dense should the bone be underneath? Turn one dial, and the others shift just a little. Over thousands of years, that added up to something you can see in the mirror. Picture your blue-eyed ancestor again, not as a pair of bright irises floating in the void, but as an entire face your brain would read differently at first glance. Slightly lighter skin that caught the low northern sun, hackles that appeared and faded with the seasons, hair that might have been chestnut or fair instead of the deep black or dark brown that dominated earlier populations. To their contemporaries, they wouldn't just have had unusual eyes, they would have looked like a new kind of person. And that wasn't just an aesthetic shift, it came with new trade-offs. Because melanin isn't just pigment, it's armor. Strip pigment out of the iris and you get a blue eye. But you also get an eye that lets in more light, more glare, more UV. This is why people with light eyes often squint more in bright sun, get dazzled more easily, and are more prone to conditions like photophobia, light sensitivity, especially after eye injuries or surgery. That doesn't mean blue eyes are defective. It means they're tuned for a different environment. Take that same blue-eyed person and drop them into a dark northern winter. Low sun skimming the horizon for a few hours a day. And suddenly that extra light becomes an advantage. Their pupils don't have to open as wide. Their retina gets more photons for the same amount of effort. In an age before sunglasses, before artificial lighting, that might have mattered. But the story doesn't stop at brightness, because melanin also helps shield deeper structures of the eye from UV damage. People with lighter eyes, especially if they also have very fair skin, carry a slightly higher lifetime risk of certain eye conditions. Things like macular degeneration and some rare eye melanomas. The numbers are not destiny, they're probabilities nudged by how much natural sunscreen your body built in. The same pattern shows up elsewhere. Light eyes often travel with lighter skin, and lighter skin in high UV environments raises risks of skin cancer, sun damage, and cataracts. Move those same light-skinned, light-eyed people to low UV environments, and suddenly that reduced melanin helps them synthesize vitamin D more efficiently from weak sunlight. The costs and benefits flip depending on latitude. Health, in other words, is context, and that context has followed blue eyes into the modern world in more subtle ways. Some studies have found weak correlations between eye color and pain sensitivity, between iris color and risk of certain autoimmune conditions, even between eye color and how people respond to some medications or alcohol. None of these findings are simple, none are absolute, and many are still debated. But together they paint a picture, change one part of the developmental network, and tiny ripples spread across the entire body. The world, of course, didn't see any of this as gene networks and developmental trade-offs. It saw faces. To ancient farmers in Europe, the first blue eyes might have been signs of strangeness, or magic, or ancestry from the people over that way. To Bronze Age traders moving across the steppe, eye color could have acted as a kind of living passport stamp, evidence of mixing, migration, alliance. As cultures grew more complex, those perceptions hardened into stories. Myths and legends from across Eurasia often mark characters with unusually light or bright eyes, seers, heroes, outsiders, witches, divine messengers. In some traditions, blue eyes became symbols of luck and protection. The evil eye talismans of the Mediterranean are often painted bright blue, as if turning the gaze of misfortune back on itself. In others, they symbolize danger, foreignness, invasion. Fast forward to more recent history, and the blue eye takes on a new role: status marker. As European empires expanded, the traits most common in their ruling populations, light skin, light hair, light eyes, were elevated into beauty standards, and more insidiously, into false hierarchies of human worth. Paintings, novels, early films, again and again you see blue eyes cast as innocent, pure, mobile, superior. It wasn't biology speaking, it was power writing itself into people's faces. Then came the darkest chapter. In the 19th and 20th centuries, early genetic ideas were hijacked by eugenics movements. Blue eyes, along with other Nordic features, were recast as signs of racial purity. Pseudoscientists measured skulls, catalogued eye colors, drew imaginary maps of higher and lower races. In Nazi Germany, this obsession reached its logical horror. Aryan ideals, blonde hair, blue eyes, didn't just live in propaganda posters. They helped justify sterilizations, forced breeding programs, and, ultimately, genocide. An essentially neutral trait, born from a small tweak in a pigment pathway, was turned into an excuse for mass murder. All of this off one mutation that originally did nothing more than lighten an iris. This is why understanding genetics properly matters so much. There is nothing inherently superior or inferior about blue eyes, or any eye color. They are all just different solutions to the same set of environmental and historical puzzles. Different ways that human populations, living in different latitudes with different diets and cultures, solved the basic problem of surviving long enough to have children. Modern genetics backs this up relentlessly. When researchers analyze huge genomic datasets today, they don't see clean racial categories. They see gradients, overlaps, interwoven histories. The same blue eye variant that's common in Northern Europe shows up in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in scattered individuals across the globe thanks to migration, trade, conquest, and love stories that never made it into any history book. What they do see is something more subtle and more fascinating. A genetic mosaic behind every face, each of your facial features, eye shape, nose width, lip fullness, cheekbone height, jaw angle, is influenced by hundreds, sometimes thousands of tiny genetic variants. No single gene decides your nose. No single mutation creates your smile. Instead, your face is the emergent property of an orchestra of genes playing together during development, responding not just to DNA, but to hormones, nutrients, and random events in the womb. Eye color genes sit inside that orchestra. That blue eye mutation in HERC2 doesn't just flip an iris from brown to blue. It interacts with other pigment genes that also affect hair, freckles, and skin tone. Nearby regulatory regions influence how tissues grow around the eye socket, which can subtly change apparent eye size or shape. Other variants in the same neighborhoods tweak collagen, bone density, even the way fat is distributed under the skin. Geneticists are only just starting to untangle this. In the last few years, huge studies have taken 3D scans of faces and linked specific tiny facial traits to specific regions of the genome. They found clusters of variants that shift the nose bridge by a couple of millimeters, others that change how prominent the chin is, or how round the cheeks are, and again, pigment-related regions, like the ones involved in eye color, show up not just in color traits but in subtle structural ones. The same developmental toolkits get reused across the face. We are, in other words, still learning what that ancient blue eye mutation really did. It didn't just give some hunter in Mesolithic Europe a new shade of iris. It nudged an entire developmental network. It changed how light interacted with their face. It altered how others saw them, judged them, chose them as a mate, feared them as a stranger, or celebrated them in myth. Over thousands of years, those tiny shifts shaped migration patterns, beauty standards, social hierarchies, and, eventually, scientific obsessions. A flicker in a pigment pathway echoed outward into culture, politics, and identity. When you look into a blue eye today, your arm of friends, are strangers. You're not just seeing color. You're seeing the visible edge of a much deeper story. A mutation that rewired light sensitivity, reshaped risk and resilience, reconfigured the human face, and then got entangled in everything humans do best and worst: storytelling, tribalism, curiosity, cruelty, love. And the strangest part, we still don't know the whole story, because blue eyes are just one small chapter in a much larger, unfinished book. How our faces came to look the way they do, and how they're still changing. So where does that leave us now, staring into the eyes of the future? Look around a crowded city street today. You're seeing the end result of tens of thousands of years of migration, conquest, famine, sexual preference, random luck, all written in pigment in the front of the eye. Dark brown, amber, hazel, green, gray, blue. A living map of human history compressed into a single glance. But that map is still changing. Right now, globally, brown still absolutely dominates. Depending on how you count, something like 70–80% of humans alive today have dark brown eyes. Blue and gray together are maybe 8–10%. Green is even rarer. And those lighter colors are heavily concentrated in just a few regions. Northern and Eastern Europe, parts of Central Asia, scattered pockets created by migration in the Americas and Australia. Yet those regional clusters are dissolving. For most of human history, people tended to marry within their own village, valley, or at most neighboring regions. That kept local eye color patterns stable. If your valley was 90% brown-eyed, it tended to stay that way. If your coastal town in the Baltic was 40% blue-eyed, those odds held for centuries. Now, the valley is the entire planet. People from every continent are meeting, marrying, and having children at a scale unprecedented in human history. Airplanes and dating apps have done more to mix human genes in the last 50 years than whole empires did in 1,000. And when that happens, local quirks start getting averaged out. Run the numbers forward a few centuries, and the projections start to converge on a similar picture. Fewer extremes, more blending. In a world where everyone's ancestry is a complex braid of Africa, Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania, pure deep brown or ice blue will probably become less common. Hazels and lighter browns will spread, intermediate tones. Eyes that shift between brown and green in different light, subtle rings of gray or gold around the pupil, will become the norm, not because blue is disappearing but because blue is mixing. The OCA2/HERC2 mutation that first created blue eyes doesn't vanish when a blue-eyed person has kids with a brown-eyed partner. It just hides, waiting. Two carriers, people with brown or hazel eyes who still carry that ancestral mutation, can have a blue-eyed child even if no one in the family has visibly had blue eyes for generations. The gene doesn't care what your passport says. It just follows the rules of inheritance. But now a new player has stepped onto the stage, one that doesn't care about slow generational math at all. Gene editing. Today, if you really want to change your eye color, you go to a surgeon, not a geneticist. You get colored contact lenses, or you undergo risky iris surgery or laser depigmentation. All of those are surface-level hacks. The DNA in your cells still carries whatever eye color variants you were born with. CRISPR changes that. In principle, we already have the tools to edit the OCA2/HERC2 region in an embryo, tweak the melanin machinery in the iris, and predetermine a baby's future eye color before they ever open their eyes. In practice, we're nowhere near doing that safely, ethically, or legally on any real scale, but the capability is moving closer every year. Imagine a fertility clinic in 150 years. The doctor isn't just checking for disease risks. They're scrolling through a menu, height probabilities, hair texture likelihoods, eye color options. Your child's default genetic outcome is dark hazel, but with this minor edit we can match your grandmother's blue. Do you want that? Do we? Changing eye color sounds trivial compared to editing out a lethal disease. It feels like dyeing your hair at the DNA level, but it opens a door. If we're willing to alter genes for something as symbolic and aesthetic as eye color, what else are we willing to rewrite? And who gets access? The wealthy, specific cultural groups, people chasing a particular beauty standard frozen in time. We could end up recreating old hierarchies in a new form, not blue eyes as a random mesolithic accident, but blue eyes as a luxury consumer feature, a trait selected not by millennia of climate and chance, but by market demand. There's another risk too. Once we can design visible traits, we might be tempted to smooth out diversity. Parents might avoid unusual combinations. Clinics might quietly steer clients towards safe, common palettes. Over time, genetic variety that nature painstakingly produced could be edited away in a few generations, replaced by homogeneity that feels comforting in the short term and disastrous in the long one. Because that's the twist buried in the story of blue eyes. Blue eyes are a glitch that worked. One random mutation in one person, in one small corner of prehistoric Europe, slipped through every filter of natural selection. Not because it made you stronger or faster or healthier, but because it made someone else look at you a second longer, because it caught the light at dusk, because it triggered some ancient brain wiring around novelty and attention and beauty. It could easily have gone the other way. That person might have died in childhood. Their children might have had no kids of their own. A few poorly timed famines or epidemics, and every blue-eyed lineage vanishes before it even begins. The Earth we'd be living on today would look exactly the same. Same mountains, same oceans, same physics. But no one, anywhere, would have blue eyes. We wouldn't even know they were possible. That's how fragile our normal is. Every visible feature you take for granted, eye color, hair texture, skin tone, face shape, is the end product of 1,000 coin flips that just happen to come up in this particular pattern. Different flips, different humans. So what does blue tell us about diversity? It tells us that human variation is not a neat, optimized design. It's an ongoing experiment. It tells us that two people on opposite sides of the planet who look totally different at a glance are probably both carrying the exact same ancient mutation from that one Mesolithic person. That a blue-eyed child born today in Brazil and a blue-eyed child born today in Finland are distant cousins in a very literal sense. And it tells us that new surprises are still possible. Is the era of new eye colors over? Probably not. Mutations are still happening in every generation. Most do nothing. Some break things. But once in a while, a change in one of the many genes involved in melanin production, iris structure, or light scattering could tweak the way our eyes handle color in ways we've never seen. Imagine an iris that reflects light more like bird plumage, producing metallic, shifting hues. Imagine a mutation that enhances structural color, deepening greens to something almost neon in certain angles. Unlikely. Sure. Impossible. Not at all. Given enough time and enough people, the improbable becomes almost guaranteed. The real questions are social, not biological. If a radically new eye color did emerge, a vivid turquoise, a strange gold that glows in low light, how would we react? Would those individuals be celebrated, fetishized, feared, discriminated against, held up as special, or pressured to blend in? Our response would say more about us than about the mutation itself. Because underneath all this talk of pigment and genetics is a larger truth. When you strip away the layers, iris color, skin shade, hair texture, bone shape, you find the same story running through all of us. The same ancient bottlenecks, the same scattered bands of survivors holding on through droughts and ice ages, the same tiny edits to DNA, passed forward through unbroken chains of parents and children for hundreds of thousands of years. Blue eyes are just one chapter in that story. A weird, beautiful footnote written by chance and amplified by desire. Stand in front of a mirror for a moment and look into your own eyes. Brown, blue, green, gray, hazel. It doesn't matter. Behind whatever color you see are the same fused chromosomes that mark the survivors of ancient crises. The same brain-building, cooperation-favoring, language-sharpening genes that got us through near extinction again and again. In the centuries to come, as populations mix, as technology advances, as gene editing moves from science fiction to everyday clinic work, the palette of human eyes might shift. Blue might become rarer, or more common, or deliberately chosen. New shades might appear, old ones might fade, but the thing that matters most won't change. Every eye, no matter its color, is a window opened by the same improbable process. A long line of ancestors who refused to break, who carried their genes through disasters and bottlenecks, wars and plagues, all the way to you. We love to divide ourselves by what we can see. This color, that color, these features, those features. The story of blue eyes reminds us that what looks like a difference is often just a different way of being the same thing, human. And beneath every shade, every sparkle, every pattern in the iris, there's one truth staring back at us. We are all mutations that survived. So now, when you see a blue eye, you're not just looking at a color, you're looking at the fallout of a single genetic accident that refused to stay small. One tiny mutation, in one person, in one place, in one moment of deep time, and somehow it didn't disappear in the noise of history. It survived. It passed from parent to child, from village to village, across ice sheets and forests and coastlines, hitchhiking its way through love, desire, hunger, and sheer dumb luck until it rewrote the face of half a continent. Every blue eye on Earth today is part of that chain. Whether your eyes are light steel gray, deep Baltic blue, or that hazy green blue that can't quite make up its mind, they're all running on the same broken switch in the same stretch of DNA. Somewhere behind you, if you could trace your family line back far enough, you would hit the same person as everyone else with blue eyes. Not a king, not a hero. Probably just a regular hunter-forager parent. Someone who never knew their body was quietly bending the future. And that means something strange and kind of beautiful. If you have blue eyes, you are genetically related, very closely in evolutionary terms, to every other blue-eyed person on the planet. The stranger on the subway in Stockholm, the farmer in Syria, the kid in a classroom in Canada, the fisherman on a Greek island, all of you linked by a single typo in the human instruction manual, copied and recopied for thousands of years. But even if your eyes are brown, green, hazel, almost black, it doesn't put you outside the story. The blue eye mutation sits on top of a much older foundation, the bottlenecks and migrations and speciation events that shaped all of us. The same forces that fused our chromosomes, that drove Neanderthals into the ice and Denisovans into the mountains, are the ones that later decided a tiny tweak in pigment regulation was worth keeping. Blue eyes are just one visible thread in a tapestry that includes every human who has ever lived. That's the real lesson here. Human evolution isn't just about giant leaps and new species. It's about small changes that keep adding up. One amino acid swap. One regulatory switch turned slightly down. One trait that made someone just a little more noticeable around a Mesolithic campfire, or slightly better at making vitamin D in a gloomy northern winter. Most mutations vanish. A few stick. An even smaller number reshape culture, beauty standards, even how we draw faces in art. Blue eyes were never meant to happen. They just did. And we built entire stories around them. So next time you're in front of a mirror, take an extra second. Look closely at your own eyes and at your family's eyes. The flecks, the rings, the way they shift in different light. You're not just seeing color. You're seeing history, climate, survival, migration, romance, compressed into a circle a few millimeters wide. If this journey from one ancient mutation to millions of modern faces made you see yourself a little differently, let me know. Tap like so more people can find this video, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and what color your eyes are. I read as many as I can, and your stories are a big part of why these videos exist. If you want to come along for more deep dives into the hidden history written in your body, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. And if you'd like to support the channel a bit more, you can optionally join our YouTube membership. It's totally up to you, but it helps us spend more time on research and storytelling like this. However you're watching, and whatever color your eyes are, you're carrying the echoes of that one ancestor, one mutation, millions of stories, and we're just starting to read them.